to you now, 50,000 indignant New Yorkers are inside and outside Madison Square Garden in a giant demonstration demanding the veto and defeat of the Taft-Hartley slave labor bill. Ladies and gentlemen, William Z. Foster.
The Wall Street monopolists with their Taft-Hartley bill are trying to split and devitalize and hamstring the trade unions. The Taft-Hartley bill, moreover, would drastically limit the workers' right to strike. It would authorize the president to break national strikes. It would permit employers once again to use strike-breaking injunctions.
Here we go. William Z. Foster and the Communist Party. The Communist Party USA was certainly not the first socialist organization in American history. The organization struggled to establish itself in the early 1920s and peaked in its power and influence during the late 1930s. It faced heavy repression and persecution after the Second World War, but maintained a layer of members who were capable of impacting American politics. The organization ultimately stopped being a force to be reckoned with in the late 1950s, with the 1957 convention more or less ending its political significance. What made the Communist Party USA significant was that it was the first anti-imperialist organization to take hold in the country. There were certainly anti-war organizations, such as Mark Twain's Anti-Imperialist League. There had been pacifists and socialists like Eugene Debs, who had opposed war on a class basis. But the Communist Party USA was founded on the ideological breakthroughs of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, specifically the teachings of Vladimir Lenin. Lenin specifically updated the teachings of Karl Marx. Marx had rejected all nationalism, saying workers of the world unite. Marx had believed that because European capitalism was the most advanced and developed, that the working class revolution would take place in Europe. He envisioned a revolution of industrial workers taking control of the government, using the state power to centralize production and institute popular control of industries. Lenin understood that starting in the late 1800s, capitalism had moved toward its monopolistic stage of imperialism. Financial institutions were becoming dominant, with industries subservient to them, and an international financial oligarchy was emerging to replace the captains of industry who had previously had the upper hand. Instead of exporting commodities, the Western countries were engaged in the export of capital, with corporations themselves spreading their tentacles across the planet, holding back development, carving out sections of the globe for themselves as captive markets and sources of raw material. This was all explained in his book, Imperialism, The Highest Stage of Capitalism, written in 1916 and published the following year. In the era of imperialism, many working class people in the Western countries were being bought off. A layer of higher paid, skilled workers were being cultivated in the homeland, the aristocracy of labor. Their loyalty to empire was being purchased with temporary privileges. Meanwhile, the revolutionary energy was shifting to the colonized world, where entire nations were fighting to be free from the economic domination of the Western colonizers. In the colonized world, the working class could position itself at the center of struggles for national liberation, to free entire countries from the domination of the global system of imperialism. Revolutionary energy was shifting from the West to the East. Lenin argued that imperialism was causing a split in the global socialist movement. Many of the socialist and Marxist parties were dominated by the labor aristocrats who benefited from imperialism, and as a result, their revolutionary edge was slipping away. The way these various parties ended up sending workers off to die in the First World War was confirmation to Lenin that the socialist movement of the West was no longer revolutionary. Lenin said it was necessary to break with these organizations dominated by the highly paid skilled workers who benefited from imperialist crumbs, and instead to go lower and deeper to the real masses of more impoverished workers to build a genuinely revolutionary organization. After Lenin's death, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin coined the term Marxism-Leninism to describe the ideology of the Communist International, a network of political parties around the world that followed Lenin's teachings about building a movement against imperialism. Marxism-Leninism is an ideology centered around defeating imperialism and mobilizing struggles for national liberation led by the working class, with the aim of breaking countries free and enabling them to industrialize with a planned socialist economy. The ultimate goal is eventually moving all humanity toward a state of vast abundance, so all poverty, inequality, and even the need for the state itself can fade away. This final vision of a world free of scarcity and all need for coercion is called the higher stage of communism. With the understanding that defeating imperialism was the focus, shortly after taking power, the Bolsheviks convened the Congress of the Peoples of the East in Baku to unify all who were fighting against the Western colonial powers. Lenin offered military support to the Emir of Afghanistan, a very traditionalist right-wing monarch who was battling the British for control of his homeland. Stalin explained, the struggle of the Emir of Afghanistan is this waging for the independence of Afghanistan is objectively a revolutionary struggle, despite the monarchist views of the Emir and his associates, for it weakens, disintegrates, and undermines imperialism. The Communist International recognized that within the imperialist countries, there were colonized peoples and territories. It argued that the Black Belt region of the U.S. South, where African Americans were concentrated, was a colonized territory within U.S. borders, as the wealth created by the crops of the highly fertile soil was extracted to make profits for big corporations, while the Black people in this rural region lived in poverty. The Communist International argued that Black people in the United States, the descendants of slaves, were an oppressed nation because they were segregated from U.S. society and paid much lower wages than white workers. On that basis, it called for self-determination for the Black Belt, arguing that Black people should have the right to establish a separate country in the Black Belt region of the South. Though the Soviet Union is gone, and the majority of the forces around the world opposing the imperialists have more or less strayed from Marxist-Leninist thinking, the nature of imperialism and anti-imperialism has not changed. Imperialism, the system Lenin accurately described as decadent, moribund capitalism, is still prevailing in the world. The primary contradiction in the world today is the struggle between this system and the forces that are fighting to free the world from it. Marxism-Leninism laid the basis for Russia and China industrializing, the Cuban Revolution, and the wave of national liberation struggles that laid the foundation for the emerging alternative economy in the world today. The BRICS, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Bolivarian Alternative of Latin America, the Axis of Resistance in the Middle East, all exist because of the breakthroughs in the struggle against imperialism that began with Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Until the fall of the Soviet Union, the primary ideology of the forces battling against imperialism was Marxism-Leninism, and the other schools of anti-imperialist thought, such as Bolivarianism and Baathism, are all heavily influenced by Marxism-Leninism and its legacy. These forces all identify the system of imperialism, as Lenin understood it, as their enemy on the global stage. Marxism-Leninism laid the foundation on which the new world is emerging and on which modern anti-imperialist forces all arose. The Center for Political Innovation is an anti-imperialist organization that believes the future of the American working class lies in defeating imperialism. We believe the working class of the United States should align with the nations of the world struggling against imperialism and create a bloc within U.S. borders that aims to break the country out of the imperialist system. We believe a new America can be created with a government of action that fights for working families. Such a government, brought to power by a mass movement of the people, could break the power of the big banks and monopolies and restructure U.S. society to be one where the economy flourishes in alliance with the new emerging global order centered around Russia, China, and the anti-imperialist states. The working class has the most to gain from such a struggle, but it must sit at the center of an anti-monopoly coalition of all the forces that want prosperity and reject the schemes of the imperialists to save their dying system with war and a low-wage police state. With this understanding, the history of the Communist Party is extremely important for us to study. The Communist Party was the first anti-imperialist organization in American history. It was the first organization based on this understanding of the world, the understanding that imperialism and the struggle against imperialism is the defining question of our epoch. The Communist Party was highly successful and had the support of millions of people in the United States during the late 1930s when it organized industrial unions, fought for racial equality, and opposed fascism. The person whose leadership more or less defined the Communist Party USA from its inception until its collapse into irrelevance was William Z. Foster. William Z. Foster's origins as a leader come from the labor movement. Before Foster became a communist, he was a union organizer. William Z. Foster represented the anti-imperialist wing of the labor movement, the section of the American industrial working class that aligned with the Soviet Union and the peoples of the oppressed nations of the world struggling against imperialism. The labor movement was the natural outgrowth of capitalism, as feudalism was replaced by a system where profits defined production. Society divided between property owners and wage laborers. Among workers, combinations emerged, demanding better treatment from their employers, higher wages, shorter hours, safety, etc. Marx explained in the material basis for the emerging labor movement in the Communist Manifesto, writing, "The growing competition among the bourgeoisie and the resulting commercial crises make the wages of the workers ever more fluctuating. The increasing improvement of machinery, ever more rapidly developing, makes their livelihoods more and more precarious. The collisions between individual workmen and individual bourgeoisie take more and more the character of collisions between two classes. Thereupon, the workers begin to form combinations, trade unions, against the bourgeoisie. They club together in order to keep up the rates of wages. They found permanent associations in order to make provisions beforehand for each of these occasions of revolt. Here and there, the contest breaks out into riots, and now and then the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of their battle lies not in immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of workers. This union is helped by one, improved means of communication that are created by modern industry and that place workers in different localities in contact with one another. These combinations also fed the hungry and provided services for those reduced to extreme desperation. Marx acknowledged the first modern working class movement in history as being the Chartist movement in Britain. As capitalism expanded, so did the working class movement. William Z. Foster was the son of an Irish freedom fighter who had fled to the United States. He was born in a small town near Boston called Taunton, and he spent his youth in Philadelphia. He became a religious skeptic as a teen and went to work at a young age, taking on a variety of difficult jobs, including streetcar motorman, sailor, longshoreman, and lumberjack. He also worked in many factories, manufacturing lead paint, fertilizer, and railroad cars. Workers banding together to demand better treatment from their employers was something he became accustomed to in his everyday life. The first strike I actually participated in was that of the Philadelphia streetcarmen in 1895, when I was 14 years old. The strike lasted only a week, and it was very bitterly fought. The men tied up the whole trolley system in a struggle to defeat a wage cut. The company replied to break the strike with professional strike breakers and police violence. I, together with other strikers, was clubbed and ridden down by mounted police. As a traveling worker who went from city to city, taking jobs that involved physical labor, Foster observed the constant struggle to make the bosses pay the wages promised and provide fair treatment on the job. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, the primary labor union federation led by Samuel Gompers, refused to organize workers like Foster, who they considered to be unskilled. However, across the country, miners, lumberjacks, railroad workers, and workers on the factory floor were constantly banding together to get better treatment from their employers. Foster's various biographies and autobiographies tell of how he became interested in socialism because he encountered a soapbox agitator. Back in those times, it was common for radicals to stand on street corners, slightly elevated by a stool, ladder, or wooden crate, raising their voices about the need for working class power. He recalled, "One night I was walking along Broad and South Streets and noticing a street speaker, I stopped to listen. He was a socialist, apparently from the Socialist Labor Party, but his name I never learned. It was my first contact with the revolutionary movement. I listened, entranced by what the speaker said. His arguments and analysis seemed to give real meaning to all my experiences in the class struggle. His proposal was for the workers to take over the government and the industries and to abolish the profit system, and it appealed to me as the only real solution to the workers' problem. The speaker was a good one, and I drank his words eagerly. I left the meeting in great enthusiasm, later eagerly reading a couple of pamphlets I had bought at the time." He eventually joined the Socialist Party of America and the Industrial Workers of the World while living in the Pacific Northwest region. The Industrial Workers of the World was a labor union that distinguished itself from the reformist American Federation of Labor. The AFL organized skilled workers and aligned itself with Republicans and Democrats. Many AFL-affiliated unions banned foreign-born, non-English speaking, and non-white workers. The IWW was an industrial union, meaning it had no barriers based on level of skill, and all wage employees were welcome to join, regardless of their race, national origin, or spoken language. The Wobblies sought to build one big union of all workers of the entire world that would eventually organize a great general strike and seize the factories from the employers. The IWW were syndicalists or anarcho-syndicalists because they rejected all politics. They had no interest in voting or seizing control of the government or trying to change government policy in any way. Their focus was on the fight between the employers and the employees only. Syndicalists refused to sign contracts with their employers, as they felt that would recognize the boss's right to exploit them. They were known to engage in a tactic called strike on the job, which involved months of workers anonymously sabotaging company property or otherwise slowing down production and hurting the boss's profits until specific demands were met. As the Second International, or the mainstream of Marxism in Europe and the United States, became more and more reformist and associated with skilled workers, the syndicalists presented a much more radical alternative, organizing low-paid traveling workers, such as Foster, many of whom were recent immigrants. The Wobblies, as the IWW was known, spread their ideas with street agitators, songs, and theatrical performances. Joe Hill, a wobbly folk singer who was eventually sentenced to death in Utah, rewrote the lyrics to many popular melodies to put forward a class struggle message. The Wobbly songs were compiled into the Little Red Songbook. One song, for example, rewrote the words to the tune "It's a Long Way to Tipperary" to explain the root cause of unemployment and how it could be eradicated. And I have the lyrics to the song reprinted in the book, and so we'll sing it. Bill Brown was just a working man like others of his kind, lost his job and tramped the streets when work was hard to find. The landlord put him on the street, the bankers kept his dough, and this is what poor Joe would sing everywhere he'd go. It's a long way down to the soup line, it's a long way to go. It's a long way down to the soup line, and the soup is thin, I know. Goodbye, dear old pork chops. Farewell, beefsteak rare. It's a long, long way down to the soup line, but my soup is there. So Bill and 16 million more responded to the call to force the hours of labor down and thus win jobs for all. They picketed the industries and won the 4-hour day and organized a general strike so folks don't have to say it's a long way down to the soup line. It's a long way to go. Oh, it's a long way down to the soup line, and the soup is thin, I know. Goodbye to good old pork chops. Farewell, beefsteak rare. Oh, it's a long, long way down to the soup line, and my soup is there. The workers run the factories now and everyone's employed, where big machines once filled the world with hungry unemployed. We all own homes, we're living well, we're happy, free, and strong, and millionaires wear overalls and sing this little song. It's a long way down to the soup line, it's a long way to go. Oh, it's a long way down to the soup line, and the soup is thin, I know. Goodbye to good old pork chops. Farewell, beefsteak rare. Oh, it's a long, long way down to the soup line, but my soup is there. The Wobblies became famous for their free speech fights in the western United States. Little towns in the West were known to outlaw socialist organizing. If a Wobbly was arrested for giving a speech or singing a song, Wobblies from around the country would pile into the municipality and one by one get arrested for preaching revolution. Vandalism and other acts of protest might take place as well. After a while, the local town would give in and allow the free speech of socialists and radicals. Quote, I had been arrested in many free speech fights and was arrested, therefore, in Kansas, Missoula, New York, Chicago, Denver, and New York. But the most severe was in Spokane, Washington in 1909, led by the industrial workers of the world. The police arrested speakers as fast as they took the stand. The IWW therefore issued a slogan, "Fill the jails," and the national leaders sent out a call for volunteers. Soon, rugged IWW fighters began to drift in all over the West. Scores of IWW were arrested daily. They were clubbed and packed into cells so closely they could not sit down. When they protested, the hose was turned on them, drenching them in icy water. In spite of all this terrorism, the IWW heroically continued to hold street meetings. Finally, about 600 people had been arrested. The city jail was packed, and dilapidated Franklin School was used to confine large numbers of men. This old schoolhouse became a sort of local Libby prison. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a well-known Irish-American IWW leader, traveled to Washington from New York City and chained herself to a lamppost, forcing the police to cut the metal before arresting her. The police were exposed for running a brothel out of the women's detention facility. The fight went on for months before Spokane relented and allowed the IWW to openly organize among the workers. Foster told how the fight was won. Quote, "We were agreeably surprised to find out the mayor was quite sick of the whole business and would meet our committee to settle it. He would not consent to formally rescind the anti-free speech ordinance, but he did agree not to enforce it against the IWW. This was a victory for us, and we called off the fight. The Spokane free speech fight was followed during the next few years by similar struggles in various cities all over the West, and also in some eastern centers. In these bitter clashes in the West, the floating workers bravely faced policemen's clubs, jails, and vigilante mobs armed with pickaxe handles. The IWW successfully defended its right to speak on the street. The free speech struggles constituted a heroic episode in the history of American labor." William Z. Foster moved up the ranks of the Wobblies as a respected speaker and writer, and he began attending syndicalist conferences in France, Spain, and other European countries. During these years, the syndicalist movement in Europe was heavily influenced by the teachings of French intellectual Georges Sorel. There is no doubt that Sorelianism had a big impact on Foster's political development prior to becoming a Marxist-Leninist. Sorel criticized the socialist movement in Europe for building a mass movement but watering down its message. He emphasized the need to focus on organizing among a warrior caste of men who find spiritual fulfillment in violence. Sorel also spoke of the power of mythology and romanticism in inspiring revolutionary activism. Some see reflections of Sorel in the Bolshevik concept of a party of new type. But Sorel's syndicalist critique of the Marxist movement was primarily spiritual and psychological, not tactical, as Lenin's was. Sorel saw the mass parties and community organizations in Europe as watering down the message into nothing and losing the passion needed for inspiring revolt. Sorel offered a rhetorical aesthetic critique of social democratic reformists and labor aristocrats, while Lenin offered an economic one based on his understanding of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. However, Lenin and Sorel were both reflecting the same thing. Socialism in Europe had lost its revolutionary edge. And what intellectuals called the crisis of Marxism confirmed that. Marxism and socialism were everywhere to be found, but revolution was nowhere. Living standards were rising in Europe due to the ascendancy of imperialism. The reforms socialists fought for, such as public education and universal male suffrage, were helping stabilize society and not leading to a revolution. As Foster became more well-known in radical circles, he began to criticize the IWW for being cut off from the more mainstream currents of the labor movement. He developed his concept of boring from within and joining the reformist labor unions to push them in a more revolutionary direction. The idea was that a militant minority within the reformist union could push against the reformist leaders and enable the union to do important class struggle organizing. Foster loudly began opposing dual unionism and the practice of the IWW. He wrote, "The general effect of dual union policy, which prevailed as general left-wing gospel for 25 years, was to pull the militants, the most active workers, out of the trade unions and to isolate them in some sterile dual union sect. The result was to leave Gomper's reactionary clique in uncontested control of the craft unions and kill the progress of these organizations as its source by depriving them of their best fighting blood. This was an ill-advised left-wing policy, and it very much checked the growth of radicalism in the United States by reducing it to sectarianism. The most basic advantage of boring from within as a method over dual unionism was that the militants had a better approach to the workers and were thus able to win them to their side and ever decisive masses for the policies of class struggle. When the IWW rejected Foster and his allies' proposal for boring from within, They broke away to form the Syndicalist League of North America. This organization sought to bring radical politics into the AFL unions. Foster and his allies in the Syndicalist League moved to Chicago, where they worked to make alliances within the Chicago Federation of Labor. A number of Foster's lifelong allies, such as Jack Johnstone, Joe Manley, Bill Dunn, and others, joined the Chicago AFL leadership with him. When the First World War broke out in Europe, the various Marxist and socialist parties proved themselves to be completely bankrupt. They had all pledged never to support a capitalist war or vote in parliament to send workers to kill other workers, but they betrayed their promise. A small minority of radicals like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht in Germany, the Bolsheviks in Russia, and Eugene Debs in the United States refused to back down and went to prison for their anti-war stance. The IWW and the Socialist Party were effectively smashed by the U.S. government because they refused to support the war. Thousands of anti-war radicals went to prison. Eugene Debs was sent to federal prison for an anti-war speech that he gave in Canton, Ohio. The Supreme Court upheld his conviction and allowed him and other socialists to be locked up simply for publicly speaking against the war. In order to maintain his ability to continue infiltrating the AFL and organizing low-wage immigrant workers, Foster strategically agreed not to take on anti-war activism, while covertly aiding those like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and Eugene Debs who did. Foster changed the name of the Syndicalist League of North America to the International Trade Union Educational League and reluctantly participated as his union supported the war and sold war bonds. This move angered many of the more radical elements who nicknamed him E.Z. Foster and accused him of being a sellout reformist. Little did they know, covertly, Foster and his allies were preparing to launch a big campaign to unionize the meatpacking workers of Chicago's stockyards. The conditions of low-paid workers who processed meat had long been a source of outrage. Upton Sinclair's best-selling book, The Jungle, had told of a family from Lithuania and how they lived amid the low wages and harsh conditions of the stockyards, processing meat for poverty wages. Amid the First World War, Foster and his allies in the Chicago Federation of Labor launched a public relations battle against the meat factory bosses. In public mass meetings before the press and filled with hundreds of workers, the horrors of life on the factory floor were revealed. Children testified about the conditions and the low pay they received as child laborers. Workers from Eastern Europe, Italy, and Ireland told of how the bosses took advantage of their status as recent immigrants or non-English speakers to rip them off and cheat them out of their wages. Workers also described the many injuries they received on the job and how the employers often seemed uninterested in getting them medical treatment or compensating them for how they got hurt. The union adopted the slogan, "Food will win the war," and said that if meat processing workers were paid a decent wage and better safety existed in the factories, the U.S. military would be better supplied with food. Amid the public hearings, labor leaders hinted the possibility of a strike among the meat packers, which would hinder the war effort. This brought the federal government in, which was determined to prevent a strike which would hurt the war effort. In this context, government mediators forced the major food processing companies to sign a contract with the Stockyards Labor Council. Foster explained, "The packing house victory marked a new high stage in the American labor organization. It was the first mass production trustified industry ever to be organized by the trade unions. And the victory was doubly significant in that it was accomplished by militant policies and on the application of the industrial union principle, at least in a modified form. But of course, the reactionary AFL bureaucracy learned nothing from this. For us former ITEUL militants, the campaign had a very special significance. It was a glowing justification of our boring from within policy And it showed what could be done on our theory of organizing the unorganized millions by militantly taking advantage of the war situation. Foster came out of the Chicago Stockyards campaign as a rising star in the labor movement. And as the war came to a close, he took aim at a much bigger target. Foster, with the support of the American Federation of Labor, launched the Great Steel Strike of 1919. 365,000 workers walked off the job and joined the picket lines on September 22nd, 1919. Youngstown, Pittsburgh, Gary, Buffalo, Cleveland, and many other industrial cities with steel mills were gripped by a state of near civil war. Foster directed the strike from his office in Pittsburgh, which functioned as a kind of central command in what was more or less a military operation. When hundreds of thousands of workers walked off the job and formed picket lines, he recalled, "During our big strike, the boss's terrorism reached extreme lengths. Wholesale shootings, sluggings, and arrests of strikers were the order of the day." One of Foster's top organizers was a woman named Fanny Sellens, who had long worked for the United Mine Workers of America, and she was murdered on August 26, 1919, in Pittsburgh just before the strike began. She saw police beating a miner on the picket line where there were children present. She intervened, trying to stop the attack. The police responded by shooting her 4 times and then bludgeoning her skull until she died. Foster made a point of displaying photographs of her mutilated body in strike headquarters throughout the country to highlight the utter brutality of the forces that sought to crush the Steelworkers Union. The biography, Forging American Communism, The Life of William Z. Foster, written by Edward P. Johannesmeer, describes the press coverage of the 1919 strike. Quote, "From the beginning of the strike, Foster was portrayed as the brains and active force behind the organizing drive. One steel company referred to the strike as being led not by the AFL, but by the, quote, Foster organization. To some extent, individuals who had a stake in the failure of the strike sought to portray Foster as the plotting genius behind the movement in order to discredit it. Journalist Mary Heaton Vorse described Foster as composed, confident, unempathetic, and imperishably unruffled. The press observed, the general judgment of those who have been in close contact with him is that he is a leader of exceptional ability. His oratory style was recalled by one labor activist as vigorous, militant language in the conventional terms of trade unionism. The New Republic noted he speaks elaborately of the specific details of the scientific management of strikes." All right, and this is William Z. Foster during the steel strike, giving a speech during the steel strike of 1919. Foster's radical beliefs became the subject of widespread media intrigue and congressional investigations. Foster was invited to the White House by President Woodrow Wilson, who urged him to call off the strike. In later years, one of Foster's favorite stories was telling how Woodrow Wilson spoke to him in roughneck talk, assuming he must be an ignorant worker during their White House meeting. When called before Congress, Foster was interrogated about his association with the Wobblies and his various pamphlets about syndicalism. Foster laughed off the questions and described them as youthful indiscretions, assuring the Congressional Committee that he was no longer a radical and had supported the war effort. Foster was, of course, lying through his teeth, and that would become apparent in the following years. The steel strike of 1919 ended in failure on January 8, 1920. Foster's autobiography, Pages from a Worker's Life, describes how William Hannon of the International Machinists Union maneuvered dishonestly to arrange for the National Committee to dissolve and the strike to end. After months on the picket lines, workers began returning to work, and Foster was defeated. Many in the labor movement viewed William Z. Foster as discredited by the strike's failure. Foster notes in his book on the strike, The Great Steel Strike and Its Lessons, that one of the major causes of the failure of the strike had been racism. The racism of AFL unions had prevented black workers from any opportunity to work in the steel mills. And during the strike, many had taken the opportunity to become replacement workers. Foster used this throughout his life as an example of how racism hurts all workers and why industrial unions must insist on having multiracial leadership. Foster often reflected on how the newly formed Communist Party and Communist Labor Party, two small sects that supported the Bolshevik Revolution, played a very negative role during the strike. The small groups formed by admirers of the Bolshevik Revolution focused on denouncing Foster and opposing the strike because it was led by an AFL union and not led by the IWW. The small communist groups had also put up deranged posters in Gary, Indiana, and elsewhere calling for the violent overthrow of the government and urging acts of adventurism and terrorism. After the strike, Foster found himself no longer employed as a labor organizer and supporting himself as a railroad worker. The International Trade Union Educational League remained intact, despite being shunned in radical circles for its perceived selling out during the war and the failure of the 1919 strike. It was in these difficult circumstances that Foster received an invitation from Moscow. The newly formed Soviet Union was looking to make allies among labor leaders around the world and was holding conferences with well-known labor activists. Foster went to Moscow with mining organizer Ella Reeve Mother Bloor and communist activist Earl Browder to represent the United States at the founding meeting of the Red International of Labor Unions. At the gathering, the Soviet Union tried to form a new international organization of labor organizers who were sympathetic to the Bolshevik Revolution, but it was unsuccessful. Most syndicalists and labor radicals were unwilling to accept the Bolsheviks' idea that they should do as Foster had done and bore from within the reformist labor unions. In Moscow, Foster personally met with Vladimir Lenin and found out that unlike the mistaken communists of the United States who invoked the Russian Revolution and denounced him, the Bolsheviks had actually urged their American allies to support the 1919 steel strike. Foster's position of boring from within and joining the existing labor unions in order to spread revolutionary politics had in fact been the policy of the Bolsheviks all along. Lenin later wrote a book, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, arguing in favor of the policy, as well as urging communists to run for office to spread their message. Foster wrote, I remained in Moscow about 3.5 months, and I assiduously studied the communist movement in all its ramifications. As a result of my intense observations and reading, I declared myself a communist. He reflected, before I arrived in Moscow, I must admit that I was much in doubt about the outcome of the Russian Revolution. Buried in the packing house and steel campaigns, I had not found the opportunity to free myself from the current oppositionist conception that socialism could only be brought about in a highly industrial country. But direct contact with the revolution almost immediately shattered my wrong opinion. It was soon plain as a pikestaff that in Soviet Russia, there had occurred a truly socialist revolution, just what I had been fighting for my entire adult life. After long negotiations, William Z. Foster and his labor movement allies went to Bridgman, Michigan for a secret meeting held in a forest. At the meeting, the Communist Party, the Communist Labor Party, a faction that had been expelled from the Socialist Party, along with Foster's trade union allies, all merged into a new organization called the Communist Party USA, which was recognized as the American section of the Communist International. The African Blood Brotherhood, a secret society led by Harry Haywood of black activists who taught armed self-defense against lynching and racist terror, also merged into the Communist Party at the founding Unity Convention. The convention was raided by the newly formed Bureau of Investigation, and many of those who participated in it were arrested and charged with state and federal crimes. Foster was acquitted at his trial due to a local librarian who believed advocating communism was part of his constitutional right as an American to free speech. Other leaders, such as Charles Ruthenberg, were convicted and did prison time as a result of the federal raid on the founding convention of the Communist Party in Bridgman, Michigan. The Communist Party emerged from the convention as a clandestine underground organization. Messages were sent in code. Meetings were held in secret. The Communist Party operated through a legal party called the Workers' Party of America that had officially no ties to Moscow and did not advocate a revolution. The Workers' Party held public meetings and ran for office and was secretly controlled by the illegal Communist Party. The Trade Union Educational League, dropping international from its name, functioned as the Communist Party's labor wing. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn joined the Trade Union Educational League, as did many former Wobblies. Foster organized the communists to launch campaigns in many different key industries. Foster traveled across West Virginia and Kentucky as part of the Save the Union campaign, hoping to bring more radical leadership to the miners' union. In New York City, the communists led low-wage garment workers struggling against socialist David Dubinsky and his racist, reformist union bureaucracy that was tied in with organized crime. Foster spoke to the secret meetings of workers who risked being expelled from their union for meeting with him. And at one meeting, he was shot at by a thug hired by the right-wing labor bosses. While the AFL unions officially supported Democrats and Republicans, their leaders were usually members of the Socialist Party, led by Norman Thomas. The Socialist Party, like the Labor Party in Britain and the German Social Democrat Party in Germany, preached that communists were the main impediment to winning victories for the workers. The reformist labor leaders used the menace of Bolshevism as a way to gain leverage from their employers in negotiations and get support from capitalists. Sign a contract with us so you don't have a Bolshevik revolution over here. And if you're going to have a union, wouldn't you rather it be led by us rather than the communists? Matthew Wall, the vice president of the AFL, unleashed a tirade against William Z. Foster and the Trade Union Educational League in his speech at the 1923 AFL convention. Pointing at Foster from the stage, who was seated in the balcony, Joe Hannesmeer quotes the speech calling Foster Mr. Imposter, saying he sought only the limelight so that there may roll into his coffers more dollars and cents to continue his nefarious work. Wool said that the Trade Union Educational League was intended to destroy the American Federation of Labor and was insidious, subtle, and dangerous. Foster apparently retorted back, quote, I don't have to break up the American labor movement. The labor movement is pretty badly broken up as it is. During these years, the Communist Party came back into legality and was heavily factional. William Z. Foster led one faction, and the other was led by J. Lovestone. J. Lovestone was a Lithuanian-born boxer from New York City who was, like Foster, had built up significant support within the labor movement and had a network of activists who were loyal to him. John Pepper, a communist from Hungary, was dispatched by Moscow to help direct the U.S. Communist Party, and he worked closely with J. Lovestone. The two factions that battled for control of the Communist Party during the 1920s were commonly called Lovestone Pepper and Foster Cannon. The latter referred to Foster's alliance with James P. Cannon, the respected writer and leader of the International Labor Defense, which raised money and supported class war prisoners. Stalin's speeches to the Communist Party of America chastised the U.S. organization for being so heavily divided. Stalin scolded both Foster and Lovestone for claiming to be the Stalinist faction and having his personal blessing, which neither did. Foster's ally, James Cannon, was caught organizing a secret Trotskyite faction and expelled from the party in 1927. This weakened Foster's standing and credibility and helped J. Lovestone gain more followers. In 1928, the Communist International shifted its tactics at the Sixth World Congress in Moscow. Stalin and the leaders of the global communist movement saw the Great Depression on the horizon and argued it was time to focus on preaching revolution and exposing social democrats. This meant pulling out of the existing unions and organizing the unorganized. J. Lovestone was unwilling to adopt this tactic and arguing that the United States had unique conditions and that it was necessary to continue courting social democrats as allies and working within their unions. Stalin labeled this position American exceptionalism, and J. Lovestone and his followers were pushed out of the Communist Party despite having a majority, overruled by the Communist International. Nikolai Bukharin and the right opposition in the Soviet Union aligned with J. Lovestone. Lovestone set up his own party called the Communist Party (Opposition), labeled the Bukharinites or the Lovestonites by the Communist Party. The Lovestone group worked against the Communist Party and the labor movement throughout the 1930s and eventually began cooperating with the U.S. government during the Cold War. In the 1950s, J. Lovestone became the CIA's main trade union operative. He directed U.S. intelligence agencies in their trade union work until his death in 1990, setting up the Solidarity Center, staffed by UAW employees, and the International Trade Union Confederation, both of which worked to drive communists out of labor union leadership positions and destabilize socialist countries with labor unrest right up to today. With Lovestone out of the picture, Foster emerged in 1929 as the leader of American communism, the chairman of the Communist Party. Earl Browder, a much younger American who had spent a few years working in China as a Communist International operative, became general secretary. The Communist Party moved its headquarters from New York City to Chicago in the industrial heartland, as the Communist International urged American communists to Americanize and lose their image of being foreigners or Soviet agents. While most Communist Party members were foreign-born and did not speak English, Foster and Browder were chosen strategically to improve the party's image. In literature and presidential campaigns, the communists often played up that William Z. Foster was an industrial worker from Philadelphia who had grown up as an Irish Catholic, and that Earl Browder was an Anglo free soiler from the farm country. Browder even took on the label, the man from Kansas. And his presidential campaign in 1936 had a theme song with this title. Foster proclaimed after the revolution, the National Soviet government, with its capital in Chicago or some other great industrial center, will consist of a Soviet Congress made up of local delegates and meeting annually or as often as need be to work out the general policies of the government. In 1929, the Communist Party poured all of its resources on a national level into supporting a strike of textile workers in Gastonia, North Carolina. Despite Jim Crow, black and white workers organized into the same union, led by communists, in the National Textile Workers Union. On April 1st, 1,800 workers walked off the job at the Lorey Textile Mill. Because they lived in homes owned by the company, they were all evicted, and the National Guard was sent to Gastonia to throw the families out on the street. They then set up a gigantic tent city encampment, and organizers from around the country came to support them, bringing food and supplies. The workers protected their encampment 24 hours a day with their own armed militia, walking around the camp with rifles and shotguns. On June 7th, 150 workers marched to the plant with guns, hoping to shut down the night shift carried out by scab workers. The police showed up and broke apart the march by firing into the crowd, which immediately fled. The police then brought a posse to the Union encampment, that night and demanded the workers turn over their firearms. They refused, and an armed battle broke out. The police chief was killed, and 2 officers were injured by gunfire. Fred Beale and Clarence Miller, 2 Communist Party organizers, were charged with the murder of the police chief. Ella Mae Wiggins, a local organizer and single mother who had joined the Communist Party, was shot while driving home from a union meeting. The International Labor Defense raised money from across the United States and around the world so that Fred Beale and Clarence Miller could receive bail. Once they were out on bail pending trial, the 2 men were smuggled to the Soviet Union, which granted them asylum. As the Great Depression hit, millions of working people became unemployed. The Communist Party became the party that organized unemployment councils. Communists organized crowds of impoverished workers to demand work or wages now. The unemployment councils also stopped evictions and organized soup kitchens. They were known to disrupt city council meetings and public events, loudly demanding relief for those struggling amid the economic crisis. The slogan most often used was, "Don't starve, fight." The writer Mike Quinn of San Francisco described the atmosphere in his reinvention of a classic nursery rhyme. There was an old woman who lived in a shoe. She had so many children, she didn't know what to do. So she gave them red banners and taught them to yell, and they marched to City Hall and raised bloody hell. The Communist Party's organizing of national hunger marches, where thousands of unemployed workers piled into Washington, D.C., brought new organizers into their ranks. The unemployed movement captured a kind of energy the country had not seen among the poor and hungry. The economic growth of the Soviet Union, while the rest of the world was experiencing an economic meltdown, also added significant prestige and credibility to the communists. March 6, 1930 was declared International Unemployment Day by the Communist International, and riots took place in every Western capitalist country. In New York City, William Z. Foster was the key organizer of the march, openly speaking about communism and how unemployment would be eliminated in a Soviet America in the lead up to the event. Forging American Communism describes how the march was organized. In preparation, team leaders were chosen and instructed in self-defense as well as propaganda. Leaflets read "Work or Wages," unemployment insurance financed by taxes on profits and inheritances administered by the workers, immediate relief for the unemployed by grants from government funds, 7-hour workday, 5 days a week, no overtime. Joe Hannesmeer's biography goes on to tell how the night before the International Unemployment Day, the Communist Party held a mass meeting to memorialize Charles Ruthenberg, an early leader of the party who had died. Foster took the podium before thousands of people, nervously anticipating the big battle the following day. He exuded confidence, born of a lifetime of such speeches, but his style was, as always, restrained. He didn't work to arouse emotions of the crowd. He seemed less an agitator than a skilled raconteur, often embellishing his narrative with working-class idiom. Foster's hand gestures were telling. Instead of gesticulating, imploring, or waving, one of his hands simply flowed in a controlled chopping motion as he spoke, keeping cadence and registering emphasis. He delighted the crowd with a story of European aristocrats, suddenly impoverished, working as busboys and peddlers in Paris. He ridiculed the commissioner of police, Grover Whalen. At the conclusion of his speech, the crowd roared with approval. On March 6th, the New York City mayor canceled all of his appointments for the day. Police with rifles were positioned on the roofs of buildings surrounding Union Square. 250 police were assembled to protect City Hall from any possible attack. The Communist Party set up 5 different stages across Union Square, and the crowd that assembled was much larger than either the organizers or city officials had anticipated. James R. Barrett's William Z. Foster and the Tragedy of American Radicalism describes the dramatic events of the day. In New York City, between 50 and 100,000 protesters waited in Union Square across from the Communist Party headquarters for permission to march. The mood was tense. Foster led a committee in negotiations with Police Commissioner Grover Whalen, who offered his car to transport the committee to City Hall, but refused the party's request for a parade permit. Foster mounted the speaker's stand. Al Richmond, a young communist organizer, later recalled the scene. Foster stood on the central platform, tall and erect, his figure against the sun. The city authorities, he said, had handed over the streets to every monarchist and militarist exploiter of Europe and America, but had denied them to the unemployed workers of New York. "Will you take that for an answer?" Foster asked. The crowd roared, "No!" "Then I advise you to fall in line and proceed," he shouted, pointing in the direction of City Hall. Thousands poured onto Broadway singing the Internationale and starting what the New York Times called the worst riot in generations. 1,000 policemen immediately waded into the crowds, flailing with blackjacks and nightsticks. The crowd pelted them with bricks. What followed, Richmond recalled, is a hazy jumble in my mind. The roar of motorcycles, the whine of sirens. The square was filled with screams. Demonstrators, some of them drenched in blood, ran in all directions. By the time the bloody fighting had subsided, 4 policemen and more than 100 civilians were injured. Amid the melee, Foster and his committee made their way to City Hall and were promptly arrested and charged with serious felonies, inciting a riot, assault in the second degree, and conspiracy. As soon as he was released, Foster promptly confronted New York City's Mayor Jimmy Walker and presented him with a list of demands on behalf of the March 6th demonstration. Foster employed his most aggressive language with Jimmy Walker, the kind of slick politician for whom he had contempt. "You cannot cure unemployment except by the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of a Soviet government in the United States." Later at his trial, Foster predicted that the growing army of unemployed are not going to starve on the streets, they are going to fight. The problem of unemployment in the final analysis, Foster argued, can only be solved by the abolition of the capitalist system and the establishment of a workers' and farmers' government. The Communist Party and the Trade Union Unity League organized the unemployed not only for the purpose of immediate demands, but for the revolutionary goal. Foster was sentenced to 6 months in New York City's prison system for organizing the March 6th demonstration. During his time in prison, served on Rikers Island, Hart Island, and Welfare Island, Foster directly observed 2 taboo subjects rarely discussed in the United States during the 1930s: homosexuality and drug addiction. Foster described the way the eyes of drug-addicted prisoners lit up when discussing heroin, as well as the ulcers, wounds, and scars he saw on the bodies of long-term users. To make way against the terrible drug-taking evil, the basic thing to do is treat addicts on the basis of hospitalization rather than imprisonment. Imprisonment, no matter how long and severe, is quite useless to cure the heroin taker. It tortures him, but it does not break his habit. In his memoir, Pages from a Worker's Life, he wrote about the prison vice, saying, "Sexual abnormalities were widespread in the New York State Penitentiary. Every known substitute for normal sexual relations was practiced by sex-starved prisoners." He wrote about how sexual encounters were arranged with full knowledge of the guards in the prison hospital, with the, quote, girls being paid in cigarettes. Quote, "I stayed one night in the Welfare Island Hospital, where there were half a dozen prisoners being entertained by one smirking fag. He observed, the occupation of a guard in a prison usually brings out all that is mean and brutal in a man. He also concluded that the parole system was just one of the many ways in which New York manufactured habitual criminals. In 1932, communists were involved in organizing the famous Bonus Army of 43,000 people, including 17,000 military veterans, that occupied the National Mall in Washington, D.C., demanding the payment of veterans' benefits to those who had fought in World War I. James W. Ford, an African-American veteran of the war and a member of the Communist Party, functioned as one of the most well-known leaders of the veterans' mobilizations. On July 28th, the peaceful encampment was cleared out with tear gas as the 12th Infantry Regiment marched into the National Mall with fixed bayonets. General Douglas MacArthur oversaw the operation, and future General George Patton was on the scene directing the 3rd Cavalry Regiment. A squad of tanks was rolled out, tents were torn down, and thousands were cleared out of the park in the center of the U.S. Capitol. 2 veterans, Eric Carlson and William Hushka, were killed by a police officer who drew his revolver and shot them during the fighting. After he was released from prison, William Z. Foster ran for president in 1932 on the communist ticket. Foster published a book entitled Toward Soviet America, which laid out a blueprint for what a Soviet America might look like and explained that the causes of the Great Depression were rooted in the system. In the book, Foster explained, imperialism is the era of monopolistic capitalism. The development of world imperialism enormously sharpened all the contradictions of capitalism. The major economic contradiction between producing and consuming powers of the masses was vastly deepened. The productive powers were increased, the exploitation of the workers in industrial countries and the colonial masses was intensified, the class struggle became more acute, and the war danger more menacing. The great powers began to fight more relentlessly to conquer the lagging markets, to dispose of their choking surpluses of commodities, to win new sources of supplies of raw materials for their industries, and redivide the world to their respective advantage. Capitalism began definitely to show the signs of developing a general crisis. The greatest and most imminent of war dangers is that between world imperialism and the Soviet Union. This antagonism is the most fundamental of all economic, political, and social conflicts. The major political objective of world capitalism is to overthrow the Soviet government. The capitalist central world strategy is to bridge over their own contradictions to sufficiently enable them to make a united front in a war against the First Workers' Republic. Ingrained in the very fiber of world imperialism is the slogan, "Death to the Soviet Union." This is the struggle between 2 antagonistic world systems, capitalism and socialism. It grows ever stronger with the deepening of the general capitalist crisis. Upon this central contradiction, capitalism will eventually break its worthless neck. Capitalism is doomed. The capitalist system of private ownership of industry and land, production for profit, and exploitation of workers is reaching the end of its course. It has outlived its historic mission. In its earlier stages, capitalism was a progressive system. It constituted an advance over feudalism, which preceded it. Under capitalism, there has been built an industrial system, at least in the imperialist countries. Industrial technique has been developed. The proletariat has been created and disciplined. But even the limited progress that capitalism has accomplished for humanity has been achieved at the cost of incredible misery, poverty, ignorance, and slaughter of the working class. Capitalism has created the objective conditions for socialism, but it can go no further. It cannot carry society to higher stages, to socialism and communism. It has become an obstacle to the upward path of humanity, a means of condemning hundreds of millions of people to mass starvation and death. History will soon sweep aside this obsolete system. History will prove that capitalism has provided its own executioners and its own gravediggers, the proletariat. The workers and the peasants of the world are getting ready for their great social task of abolishing capitalism and establishing socialism. James W. Ford, the black veteran who had led the bonus army, was Foster's running mate in 1932. The Communist Party emphasized the demand for self-determination for the Black Belt, creating an independent government in the majority African-American regions of the Black Belt, of the South. Many prominent African Americans joined the Communist Party due to its opposition to segregation. The Communist Party raised the slogan, "Death penalty for lynchers," and frequently highlighted the brutal atrocities committed against African Americans. The Communist Party also exposed the crimes of British and French colonialism in Africa and presented Black Americans as an oppressed nationality within U.S. borders rather than merely victims of racism. In 1932 presidential campaign, the 1932 presidential campaign tour was extremely stressful for Foster, as he was arrested in almost every city that he visited. In Los Angeles, he described how while being held in a city jail, he was seized by two police behind me, one wearing lead gloves, began to punch me viciously in the stomach and the groin. I could only squirm to protect myself. Not long afterwards, a reporter from the Los Angeles Times called to interview me, and although I told him about the whole thing, not a line of it appeared in his paper. During the final months of the 1932 presidential campaign, William Z. Foster had a massive heart attack and was forced to flee to the Soviet Union for medical care. In his absence, Earl Browder became the public face of American communism and moved the headquarters away from Chicago to New York City, back to New York City. Foster returned to the United States months later, but his health limited his ability to travel. He stepped back from traveling across the country for the next few years, functioning as a kind of consultant and advisor to the Communist Party's network of labor organizers. With Foster advising and directing them from his apartment in the Bronx, the Communist Party's Trade Union Unity League was leading huge historic struggles. The summer of 1934 was a turning point in U.S. history as the struggle went beyond the desperate unemployed to organized workers on the job. In San Francisco, the dock workers held a general strike. Unlike previous strikes where the Black community was used as scab labor, this time communist leaders of the Union, Harry Bridges and Foster's protege, Samuel Darcy, made the hiring of Black workers a central demand of the strike. The dock workers were victorious as the International Longshore Warehouse Union won control of the docks. Minneapolis was shut down by a strike of truck drivers organized into the Teamsters. Toledo was shut down by the auto light workers, and the National Guard was sent in. Furthermore, sharecroppers and textile workers struck all across the U.S. South. South Carolina declared a state of emergency as the Communist Party led workers, Black and white, to demand better treatment. 1934 was a turning point where the uprising of the unemployed had aligned itself with workers on the job. The Communist Party was at the center of the labor upsurge that shook the country and had a large amount of influence in most major cities and in the rural southern states. It has been revealed that in the circumstances of rising class struggle, Wall Street plotted a military coup to overthrow Franklin Roosevelt and establish a military dictatorship. U.S. Marine Corps General Smedley Butler revealed in congressional testimony the details of the business plot in which a number of people had approached him about toppling Roosevelt in coordination with the American Legion. It was shortly after the summer of 1934, when the country faced a huge amount of labor unrest, that the Roosevelt administration began enacting dramatic reforms. The reforms came in response to the coup and the rising threats of unrest. It was already revealed by congressional testimony from U.S. Marine Corps General Smedley Butler that some among the rich had been plotting to have the military depose Roosevelt. U.S. mainstream newspapers mocked and tried to downplay the business plot that was revealed in 1933. But after the 1934 summer strike wave, the fascist aspirations of many wealthy people became very hard to conceal. The National Association of Manufacturers began accusing Roosevelt of being a Soviet agent for allowing the strikes to happen. Many industrialists, including Henry Ford, proclaimed that the labor movement must be smashed and expressed admiration for Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, who had successfully crushed the labor movement and the communist-led unrest in their respective countries. In the face of opposition from his own class, Roosevelt passed the Wagner Act in 1935, a federal law granting the right of all workers to strike and creating the National Labor Relations Board to oversee the process of mediating labor unrest. This was done to recruit the labor unions, mainly the American Federation of Labor, to protect and support him against the businessmen who wanted his ouster. Roosevelt also created the Works Progress Administration and began hiring millions of unemployed men to build infrastructure around the country. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, wore bright green uniforms and slept in tents as they were dispatched to pave roads, build bridges, construct post offices, and do other useful work in order to stimulate the economy. Roosevelt also established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. He created the Federal Theater Project and hired unemployed actors to begin performing plays for school children across the country. One of the plays was Revolt of the Beavers, a hardly veiled Marxist allegory about beavers who go on strike and eventually overthrow the greedy beaver who hoards all the wood for himself. The Federal Theater Project also performed a play called It Can't Happen Here, warning about the danger of a fascist coup by right-wing demagogues who hate labor unions. Roosevelt was positioning himself as a friend of organized labor, the unemployed, the Soviet Union, and political leftists in the hopes that they would function as his foot soldiers and enable him to stay in power. This is what Marxists call Bonapartism. Vince Copeland explained the concept in his book. This phenomenon of calling upon one class against another and seeming to rise above class while serving the status quo has been called Bonapartism after Napoleon Bonaparte and his nephew Louis Bonaparte. The first Bonaparte was so all-powerful and seemed to concentrate all political power so much in his own person that the feudal kings of Europe literally pushed one another aside to kiss his hands. This was before they ganged up with the British bourgeoisie to defeat him in 1815. Actually, Napoleon's tremendous political power flowed from the fact that with military means, he could save the new bourgeois bankers from the political overthrow of the feudal aristocracy, while at the same time using the same means, he held down the revolutionary masses who were willing to fight feudalism to the end. Copeland explained how Roosevelt functioned as a prime example of Bonapartism in American history. Roosevelt, by intervening on behalf of millions in the way he did, kept the system from failing. It had been more or less correctly said he opposed capitalists in order to save capitalism. But in order to carry out such a hazardous operation as opposing capitalists, while serving as the chief political presiding officer of the U.S. capitalist system, Roosevelt had to gain for himself considerable social base within the enemy class, the working class, which includes the unemployed, as he had been able to utilize this class against the capitalists whose system he ultimately served. It must be noted that the strike wave of 1934 was certainly massive, but significantly smaller than the 1877 railroad strike. There were other episodes of labor unrest in U.S. history of similar size that did not result in anything near as massive in terms of reforms in society compared to Roosevelt's dramatic moves. The 1877 railroad strike resulted in nothing more than the creation of an armory system throughout the country to effectively quell unrest. While much smaller strike waves took place in 1934, it won federal laws recognizing the right of workers to unionize and the hiring of millions of unemployed workers into a federal jobs program. Just 4 years later, the government created Social Security, unemployment insurance, and the Fair Labor Standards Act. Why did the strike wave of 1934 result in so many great victories for the American working class? The obvious reason is that unlike the 1877 railroad strike, the 1934 strikers were largely aligned with a government that controlled 1/5 of the planet. Their unrest represented one division in a global struggle against imperialism, which at the time was in the grip of the longest economic crisis that had ever taken place. As the Western imperialist system was becoming unstable, with rising unemployment and unrest, the Soviet Union was having an economic boom. The USSR was building the world's largest power plants, wiping out illiteracy, and almost overnight becoming a fully industrialized country. Divisions in the ruling class, resulting from the instability and long-term economic crisis, created an opening that allowed many key reforms in U.S. society. The Seventh World Congress of the Communist International was convened on August 2nd, 1935. Bulgarian communist leader Georgy Dimitrov, recently freed from Nazi prisons, spoke to the gathering in Moscow about the need to build a united front against fascism. He said, "The imperialist circles are trying to shift the whole burden of the crisis onto the shoulders of working people. That is why they need fascism. They are trying to solve the problems of markets by enslaving weak nations, by intensifying colonial oppression and repartitioning the world anew by means of war. That is why they need fascism. They are striving to forestall the growth of the forces of revolution by smashing the revolutionary movement of workers and peasants and by undertaking a military attack against the Soviet Union, the bulwark of the world proletariat. That is why they need fascism." Instead of class against class policies cemented at the Sixth World Congress that focused on exposing social democrats, the new tactical orientation was for communists to sit at the center of a broad anti-fascist alliance. The idea was that capitalism was naturally moving toward fascism, so communists could position themselves as the most effective anti-fascists with their scientific Marxist understanding and their anti-capitalist orientation. The capitalists of the world, Dimitrov argued, were dividing between the democratic bourgeoisie and the fascist bourgeoisie. The democratic bourgeoisie would desperately need the communists and the working class as allies to protect them from fascism. Communists would lead a people's front against fascism, and this could open the door to a revolution. Dimitrov urged the communist parties to build mass anti-fascist movements based on their own unique histories and traditions of their respective countries and not hand this history over to the fascists. He wrote, "Under no circumstances must we underrate fascism's power of ideological infection. The fascists are rummaging through the entire history of every nation so as to be able to pose as the heirs and continuers of all that was exalted and heroic in their past. Mussolini does his utmost to make capital for himself out of the heroic figure of Garibaldi. The French fascists bring to the fore as their heroine Joan of Arc. The American fascists appeal to the traditions of the American War of Independence, the traditions of Washington and of Lincoln. We communists are the irreconcilable opponents in principle of bourgeois nationalism in all its forms, but we are not supporters of national nihilism and never should act as such. The task of educating people and the workers and all working people in the spirit of proletarian internationalism is one of the most fundamental tasks of the Communist Party. But anyone who thinks that this permits him to sneer at the national sentiments of the broad masses has understood nothing about the teachings of Lenin on the national question. In the United States, Earl Browder presided over swiftly reorienting the Communist Party to the new line. The ranks of the Communist Party were opened up to many middle-class elements, and the requirements for party membership were loosened. Many college professors, Broadway actors, Hollywood screenwriters, and others joined the Communist Party on the basis of opposing fascism and admiring the Soviet Union. The Communist Party also emphasized patriotism in all its speeches and publications and claimed that America's tradition was democratic and opposed to fascism. Communist Party members were expected to know every single verse of the Star-Spangled Banner, and communist rallies in Madison Square Garden began with the Pledge of Allegiance. The bulk of the Communist Party's leadership remained militant trade unionists and former IWW members who had worked with Foster. While Browder focused on expanding the party's influence among broader anti-fascist and liberal circles, the trade union old guard were active in setting the stage for the big fight ahead. It was no secret that Earl Browder and William Z. Foster were rivals. Foster considered Browder to be a kind of career politician with a middle-class orientation who loved to pander to Roosevelt's liberal friends. Browder considered Foster to be somewhat of an unreformed syndicalist and thought his crew of labor organizers, such as Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Eugene Dennis, and others, were foul-mouthed, uncultured, and a bit too enthusiastic about violence and illegal tactics on the picket line. Foster was being forced into the background at the New York City Madison Square Garden and Carnegie Hall rallies. And Browder's efforts to tone down the Communist Party's radical image did not go unnoticed. But as a democratic centralist organization, the Communist Party publicly did not acknowledge disagreements that pretty much everyone who observed the party from outside could easily detect. At national committee meetings, every resolution and decision the party made was unanimous, and disagreements were kept behind closed doors. In 1936, Earl Browder ran for president on a platform he described as democracy or fascism. Roosevelt was considered to be an ally of the labor movement and the anti-fascist elements in American society. Browder focused on defeating the Republicans. Though he ran and received thousands of votes, the Communist Party did everything it could to secure Roosevelt's victory. When John L. Lewis, leader of the Miners' Union, led his allies in the Committee for Industrial Organization to walk out of the American Federation of Labor Convention, this created an opening for the Communist Party's network of labor organizers, all of whom had been taught and mentored by Foster. The new labor federation, called the Congress of Industrial Organizations, began hiring communists as full-time organizers. The CIO, unlike the AFL, had no ban on communists. The 1936 election marked the peak of Roosevelt's Bonapartist rhetoric. In his famous Madison Square Garden speech, he proclaimed he welcomed their hatred, referring to Wall Street's opposition to him. Roosevelt condemned war profiteers, sweatshop factory owners, and others who enriched themselves as Americans starved, and emphasized, "We have just begun to fight," with his reforms to improve working people's lives. In that speech, Roosevelt referred to the fact that many factory owners were saying that if he won the election, there would be layoffs. The very employers and politicians and publishers who talk the most loudly of class antagonism and the destruction of the American system now undermine that system by an attempt to coerce the votes of wage earners of this country. It is the 1936 version of the old threat to close down the factory or the office if a particular candidate does not win. It is an old strategy of tyrants to delude their victims into fighting their battles for them. Every message in a pay envelope, even if it is the truth, is a command to vote according to the will of the employer. But this propaganda is worse. It is deceit. When Roosevelt won the 1936 election, the factory owners made good on their threats and started laying off workers, blaming Roosevelt's heavy taxation of corporate profits. In Akron, Ohio, rubber workers responded to the threat of layoffs by occupying their factory, seizing the plant in a sit-down strike, forcing the boss to give in and let the workers keep their jobs. In the final days of 1936, the Great Flint Sit-Down Strike began in Michigan. Thousands and thousands of workers piled into the city, setting up an encampment to support the workers inside of the General Motors plant, who sat down in response to the threat of layoffs. The book Labor's Giant Step by Art Prius describes how a direct physical clash came on January 12th. The company had shut off the heat in an attempt to freeze out the sit-downers in Fisher Body Plant 2. Soon after, the police announced there would be no more food allowed to enter the plant for the strikers. The cops blocked off the entrance and knocked down a ladder to a window which supplies were being shipped. A body of pickets stormed the entrance and carried coffee and bread to the sit-downers. Tear gas was fired into the plant. Police sent volleys of buckshot through the windows. The strikers fought back with everything from hurled nuts and bolts to soda pop bottles. A 3-hour battle ensued. When the course of the struggle, the strikers captured the sheriff's car and 3 police cruisers. When the police reformed ranks at midnight to make a new attack, the strikers brought into play their secret weapon, a fire hose that soaked the police with freezing water and drove them back to the other side of the bridge leading to the plant gates. John L. Lewis of the Miners Union and president of the newly formed CIO confronted the governor of Michigan about his plans to clear the plant with the soldiers. He told the governor, as quoted in Labor's Untold Story by Richard O. Boyer and Herbert M. Moraes, "I shall personally enter the General Motors plant Chevrolet number 4. I shall order the men to disregard your order and stand fast. I shall walk to the largest window of the plant, open it up, and divest myself of outer raiment, remove my shirt, and bare my bosom. When you order these troops to fire, mine will be the first breast that they will strike." After consulting Roosevelt, Governor Murphy ordered the National Guard troops in Flint to point their machine guns away from the factory. The military was protecting the striking workers and would not be used to clear them out. On February 11th, General Motors signed a 6-month agreement with the union, and the workers walked out of the plant victorious, greeted by a crowd of thousands and thousands of supporters. The single black worker employed in the plant, who stayed inside throughout the sit-down occupation, carried the American flag. 1937 then became the year of the sit-down strike wave, with the CIO expanding across the country with workplace occupations. Art Prius writes, "It was an inspiring victory to all American labor in 1937. The floodgates of class struggle were opened. The cry, 'Sit down,' echoed from one end of the land to the other." 1 month after the end of the General Motors strike, some 193,000 workers engaged in 247 sit-down strikes. Nearly 500,000 took up this weapon before 1937 had ended. The number of strikes went from 2,172 in 1936 to 4,740 in 1937, with 1,861,000 workers involved. That is the way the CIO was built and consolidated. The leaders of the Flint sit-down strike were students of William Z. Foster. The founder of the UAW union were Wyndham Mortimer, Homer Martin, and Bill McKay, who were either card-carrying communists or individuals who had worked very closely with the party. Walter Reuther, the social democrat who eventually emerged to become the UAW boss for the following decade, pandered to the communists pretty hard during the late 1930s. He visited the Soviet Union and briefly worked in a Soviet auto plant as a political statement. He praised Stalin in his speeches. He eventually became an anti-communist in the post-war years. But in the 1930s, the UAW and the CIO were part of Roosevelt's anti-fascist coalition. And that coalition included communists as well-respected friends. Roosevelt more or less encouraged the sit-down strike wave, seeing it as an opportunity to protect himself from the National Association of Manufacturers, many of whom were openly admiring fascism and sought his overthrow. Roosevelt passed Social Security and the Fair Labor Standards Act, ensuring more protections for working families and for the unemployed. The National Association of Manufacturers began circulating a pamphlet called "Join the CIO and Help Build a Soviet America, a Factual Narrative." The pamphlet told workers that if they joined the CIO and participated in the sit-down strike wave, they were helping pave the way for William Z. Foster to become the American Stalin. Hundreds of thousands of copies of the pamphlet were distributed, but the CIO continued to expand. In 1937, the Little Steel Strike, led by the Communist Party, continued what William Z. Foster had started with his 1919 Great Steel Strike. Foster had led members of the Communist Party to form the Steel Workers Organizing Committee and pushed to bring steel workers into the CIO and force the steel bosses to sign a union contract. The Midwestern industrial cities of Chicago, Youngstown, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland became battlefields when steel workers walked out in May of 1937. On May 30th, the Chicago police carried out the Memorial Day Massacre, and 10 unarmed striking workers were killed while protesting outside the gates of the Republic Steel plant. Gus Hall, one of Foster's trusted lieutenants in the Steelworker Organizing Committee, described how a small town called Warren, Ohio, became the site of the most intense confrontations. Gus described, "For Republic Steel, the Warren plant was the key plant. Because Warren had been a conservative city, Republic went all out to defeat the strike. They prepared for war, and this was especially true at the Warren plant. The Republic Steel plant in Warren was big enough for landing airplanes, so Republic hired small planes filled with scabs and food from around the country. That's how they brought in the strikebreakers. But here again, the initiative of workers took hold. Many of them were deer hunters, and they got their guns and they placed themselves in the swamps waiting for the planes to come. They shot at scab planes enough that 2 of them crashed upon landing inside the plant, and that brought Republic's scab flights to an end. It was hardly dark when I reached the pickets. I hardly believed what I saw. The backside of the factory looked like a scene from the First World War, a battlefield. There were barbed wire fences and floodlights lighting up the place from one end to another. The idea itself was unique enough, but when I asked where they got the money to buy the materials, the answer was just unbelievable. These workers, rank and file workers, had organized themselves in teams, and they had canvassed local business people and got materials donated for free and set up this warlike scene with floodlights and barbed wire fences. Later, the streets running into the plant became a problem. The action of the steelworkers was direct and simple. They simply closed the streets off, and only those with a pass signed by me, the chairman of the strike committee, could come and go. There were a number of crises about these street closings, especially when the mayor and the police chief were forced to get a pass signed by me, a known communist and chair of the strike committee. On August 23, 1939, the Soviet Union signed a temporary non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. This was done out of desperation because the French had broken their anti-fascist alliance with the USSR, and all other Western capitalist countries refused to join the Soviet Union in a pact against the Nazis. The Soviet Union and Mexico had been the only countries that would aid the Spanish Republic, which was eventually overthrown by fascist General Francisco Franco. Seeing that war was on the horizon and hoping to buy time, the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The U.S. media began loudly denouncing communists as hypocrites. They had been building huge anti-fascist protests, boycotting Japanese and German companies, and disrupting pro-Nazi speakers and events. But now that the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with the Nazis, and communist leaders were now calling Roosevelt a warmonger and urging the USA not to align with the British Empire. Time magazine began calling communists the communazis. Earl Browder was sent to federal prison for a minor passport violation, a move by the Roosevelt administration and the Department of Justice that was clearly intended as retaliation against the Soviet Union for the pact. However, the pact was broken by the Nazis on June 22, 1941. The Soviet Union began mobilizing the population to defeat a Nazi invasion. On December 7th of the same year, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered the Second World War, aligned with the Soviet Union and Britain against Germany, Italy, and Japan. 27 million people in the Soviet Union gave their lives to defeat the Nazi invaders. The Battle of Stalingrad is remembered as a turning point in the war. General Douglas MacArthur remarked, "The scale and grandeur of the Russian effort mark it as the greatest military achievement in all of history." During the Second World War, the American communists went to extreme lengths to demobilize class struggle within the country and focus on winning the war. The Communist Party sent a letter to its Japanese members, urging them to comply with internment and more or less expelling them. Earl Browder urged Democrats and Republicans not to have competitive elections in 1944, but rather to form a joint win-the-war ticket with both parties voting for the same candidates as a way to show national unity. When Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt met in Tehran in 1943, Earl Browder saw it as a pivotal moment in world history. He composed a book called Tehran, Our Path in War and Peace, and completely repudiated Marxism-Leninism. He announced that after the war, strikes would no longer be necessary, as employers and workers would be unified on an anti-fascist basis. He declared that U.S. imperialism was no longer a threat, but rather a force for spreading democracy around the world. He called for the Communist Party to dissolve and become the Communist Political Association. He predicted that eventually the Soviet Union and the United States would merge into one country that would combine the best elements of both systems, arguing that the menace of fascism had created a democratic upsurge that would bond democratic capitalists and workers together. Browder ultimately got his way, and the Communist Party was dissolved in 1944. The Communist Political Association described itself as Marxist-Jeffersonian rather than Marxist-Leninist. Foster, Flynn, and others were horrified by Browder's moves, but were forced to comply out of fear of expulsion. Browder's moves were unanimously ratified, despite widespread internal disgust, especially among Foster's labor allies. Browder was apparently in direct communication with the U.S. State Department and the Roosevelt administration throughout the war. Foster described one particular incident in his history of the Communist Party of the United States. During World War II, as part of developing revisionism, Browder departed fundamentally from the party's correct line toward the Chinese Revolution. His opportunism became marked after his interview with Assistant Secretary of State Sumner Welles in October of 1942. Browder had previously made a statement criticizing the anti-communist policy of the Roosevelt administration in China. Welles summoned Browder to Washington for this and gave him a statement denying Browder's allegations and asserting that the United States aimed at unifying the forces of Chiang Kai-shek and the communists in China. This unity policy amounted to no more than a wartime effort to turn all Chinese guns against the Japanese, but Browder interpreted it as genuine long-term desire to establish a democratic Chinese national unity. He swallowed Welles' proposition whole, apologized publicly for his previous statement attacking the State Department's China policy, and thenceforth became a supporter of the reactionary line of American imperialism in China. Whispers throughout the party indicated that globally the communist movement was just as disgusted by Browder's moves as many American communists were. Confirmation of this came from Jacques Duclos, a leader of the French Communist Party, who wrote an article condemning Browderism and saying that the theories put forward in the Tehran book and the dissolution of the Communist Party were disastrously wrong. The Soviet Union apparently liked the article very much and translated it into many languages, sending it all over the world. Duclos' denunciation of Browderism was published and read by millions in Russia, China, France, Germany, Britain, and elsewhere. Mao Zedong spoke up and condemned Browderism in his own statements as well. As the Second World War was ending, the Communist Political Association convened an emergency convention to dissolve and reestablish the Communist Party. The moment represented a sweeping uprising from the rank and file of the Communist Party, many of whom were disgusted by Browderism. Party leaders got up and loudly condemned policies that they had quietly stomached for years. During the late 1930s, to some degree, and most especially during the war, the Communist Party seemed to have lost its revolutionary edge. While it defended the Soviet Union on domestic issues, the communist publications sounded almost like those of a typical FDR supporter. Browder's clique in the leadership seemed more worried about suppressing people who sounded too radical and might scare off the Democrats than about promoting Marxist-Leninist ideology. William Z. Foster, who had long despised Browder, led the charge against Browder and his revisionism. Foster explained, "The very foundation of Marxism-Leninism is that of the working class, and the Communist Party at its head leads the democratic masses of people in amelioration of their conditions under capitalism and also in the eventual establishment of socialism. Browder has thrown this whole conception overboard. Comrade Browder, in his books and speeches, paints a utopian picture of a world capitalist system, not moribund, not vigorous and progressive, but vigorous and progressive, especially in its American section. This is the liberal notion that the epoch of imperialism is in the past. It fundamentally conflicts with Leninist theory at the last stage of decadent capitalist system." Browder had quietly backed away from supporting black nationalism and the Black Belt thesis. Claudia Jones and others thunderously spoke up and led the party in reinstating the policy. Foster wrote in his History of the Party, "One of the worst elements in Browder's so-called national unity was his abandonment of the fight of the Negro people for self-determination. His theory was that the Negro people, by their attitude at the close of the Civil War, had exercised their right to self-determination and given up all perspectives of being a distinct nation. The ultimate results of this conception were grave weakening of the party's fight among the Negro people and a virtual liquidation of the Communist Party in the U.S. South." Browder had said U.S. imperialism was progressive in Latin America and that anti-colonial forces who opposed the United States during the Second World War were fascists. This had been a huge mistake, and in the post-war years, the Soviet Union was making friends with followers of Juan Perón in Argentina and other Latin American nationalists. The Communist Party announced new support for the independence of Puerto Rico and published entire books about how the U.S. was holding back the struggle of Latin American workers and farmers for land and freedom. On July 29, 1945, Mao Zedong sent William Z. Foster a personal telegram from China saying, "We are glad to learn that the Special Convention of the Communist Political Association of the United States has resolved to repudiate Browder's revisionist line, that is, capitulationist line, and has reestablished Marxist leadership and revived the Communist Party of the United States. We hereby extend to you our warm congratulations on this great victory of the working class and the Marxist movement in the United States. Beyond all doubt, the victory of the U.S. working class and its vanguard, the Communist Party of the United States, over Browder's revisionist and capitulationist line will contribute signally to the great cause in which the Chinese and American peoples are engaged, the cause of carrying on the war against Japan and building a peaceful, democratic world after the war." The Communist Party swung into a revolutionary mode following the Second World War, with William Z. Foster emerging once again as the visible ideological leader. When Winston Churchill gave his infamous Iron Curtain speech in March of 1946, the Communist Party assembled 15,000 people to gather in Union Square the following day for a rally where William Z. Foster gave a lengthy speech entitled "The Menace of a New World War." Foster told the crowd, "We are gathered together in historic Union Square at a grave moment in world history. The imperialists in the United States and Great Britain are trying to stampede the people into another world war." Winston Churchill's speech yesterday in Fulton, Missouri, was a call for a general capitalist war against the Soviet Union. His speech was built around the red bogey, and the whole business stank of fascism. It was the voice of Churchill, but the hand of Adolf Hitler. The war that Churchill wants would necessarily be a war against democracy all over the world. It would be aimed not only to overthrow the first socialist republic, but to smash the colonial liberation movements. The people of the world and this country will not stand for such an imperialist war, and they will give Churchill a resounding no that will ring all around the world. After the Second World War, the world experienced the greatest episode of economic growth that had ever occurred. As the world rebuilt from the massive destruction, the United States sat at the center of the world economy as the only Western country not to have had fighting take place on its own territory. The United States began supplying the non-communist countries of the world with food, steel, automobiles, and other commodities. As Wall Street profits skyrocketed, the industrial unions that Foster's crew of organizers had built swung into action, demanding their share. The post-war strike wave won very dramatic increases in the wages of steel workers and auto workers. The American dream of an entire family living comfortably with a home, an automobile, and a housewife who did not have to work became possible because of all the great sacrifices the CIO had made during the 1930s, forcing auto and steel bosses to sign union contracts. In 1946, the Communist Party members in the CIO led the Oakland General Strike, in which this Bay Area city was shut down for 2 entire days. Workers walked off the job in order to help win union recognition for the mostly female department store employees at Conn's and Hastings. Taking instruction from CIO unions, 100,000 workers across Alameda County did not go to work, and 5,000 union members assembled in front of the department stores, effectively blocking anyone from shopping at them. The Teamsters Union and the national leadership of the AFL quickly shut down the strike, with West Coast Teamster boss Dave Beck saying, "This damn general strike is nothing but a revolution. This isn't labor tactics. It's revolutionary tactics." The Taft-Hartley Law, passed in 1948 with Congress overriding Truman's veto, outlawed these tactics of solidarity strikes and union boycotts, greatly rolling back the ability of unions to shut down workplaces or sign closed-shop contracts with employers. While the living standards of American workers were dramatically rising, the Communist Party soon found itself facing the most serious and prolonged episode of persecution it had ever been subjected to since its founding. With U.S. imperialism ascending during the post-war economic expansion, many industrial workers who were once impoverished and struggling to find their way into the many industrial workers who were once impoverished and struggling were finding their way into the aristocracy of labor. Most labor unions banned communists from membership, and federal law forbade Communist Party members from holding elected office in any union. Much like the AFL craft unions had become conservative, the CIO soon banned communists in compliance with federal laws and merged with the AFL in 1955. The FBI worked to prevent Communist Party members from having jobs. Thousands were called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee and forced to either name co-workers and friends who had worked with the Communist Party or be imprisoned for contempt of Congress. However, the Communist Party's effective work amid so much turmoil and a hostile environment is astounding. With the American government moving against them and the public psyched up to oppose them with a new invention called television, the Communist Party still managed to figuratively move mountains in terms of its accomplishments. In 1948, the National Board of the Communist Party was indicted for conspiring to teach the violent overthrow of the American government. The 1945 National Convention to reestablish the Communist Party was declared to be a treasonous conspiracy. All the leaders were convicted and sent to federal prison. The defense proved very effectively at the 1948 Foley Square trial that the Communist Party did not advocate the violent overthrow of the government. This did not matter, as the law forbade teaching any ideology that would lead one to believe violent revolution was necessary. The conviction of the Communist Party leaders centered around the party's publication of books such as The State and Revolution and the Communist Manifesto. The Supreme Court upheld their conviction. The Communist Party's publications were banned from the mail. Hundreds of Communist Party members around the country were prosecuted under state laws that made it illegal to advocate communism or revolution. The Communist Party began to function as an illegal underground organization. Members began living under fake names across the country and distributing literature in secret. When the 1951 McCarran Internal Security Act was passed, many Communist Party members expected that they would soon be rounded up and placed in concentration camps. The law allowed the U.S. Department of Justice to assemble a list of 2 million subversives that would be put in prison camps if a national emergency was declared. The bulk of those who joined during the Popular Front period, when communism was trendy, quit under pressure. Ex-communists told wild stories about what the party really believed and was plotting, and got attention in the media. After a few years of a government crackdown, the FBI estimated that the Communist Party was down to roughly 10,000 to 20,000 members, a solid crew of the most ardent believers who would not back down. The FBI estimated that 2/3 of the party's members lived in New York City. Amid all this repression, the Communist Party still swung into action with a new focus on black liberation. The Civil Rights Congress began raising money for men accused of rape in Southern courts, black men, and facing the death penalty. Bella Abzug, who would later become a member of the U.S. Congress, became a lawyer for the Civil Rights Congress, defending Willie McGee, a black man accused of rape and executed on May 8, 1951, with many believing that he was innocent. Black communist leader William L. Patterson was given a platform at the United Nations by the Soviet mission to present a document called We Charge Genocide, accusing the U.S. government of crimes against humanity for its treatment of black Americans. Speaking to the world, Patterson said, "Out of the inhuman black ghettos of American cities, out of the cotton plantations of the South, comes this record of mass slayings on the basis of race, of lives deliberately warped and distorted by the willful creation of conditions making for premature death, poverty, and disease. It is a record that calls aloud for condemnation, for an end to these terrible injustices that constitute a daily and ever-increasing violation of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crimes of Genocide. We maintain that the oppressed Negro citizens of the United States, segregated, discriminated against, and long the target of violence, suffer from genocide as a result of consistent, conscious, and unified policies of every branch of the American government." The statement was accompanied by over 200 pages documenting the horrendous treatment of African Americans. The Soviet Union translated it into many languages and circulated it all over the world. The Communist Party sold thousands of copies of We Charge Genocide in black neighborhoods across the country, going door to door, and the black community was happy to read it despite its well-known communist authorship. Many black Americans were made aware of the fact that Stalin was on their side against the racist American government. The Civil Rights Congress was eventually declared to be a subversive organization by the U.S. Department of Justice. A special law made it illegal for the organization to put up bail for anyone who was arrested. In 1948, Henry Wallace, who had been vice president in Roosevelt's third term during the Second World War, quit the Democratic Party and ran for president. He formed the Progressive Party as a new party that opposed the Cold War and wanted to maintain friendship with the USSR. The Progressive Party opposed Jim Crow segregation and supported labor unions. Henry Wallace received over 1 million votes in the 1948 election, roughly 2.4% of the popular vote. The U.S. media constantly reminded the public that the Wallace campaign was staffed by Communist Party members and that William Z. Foster and Eugene Dennis had personally met with Wallace. Fearing that black people would vote for Wallace in urban centers due to his anti-racist stance, Harry S. Truman began speaking up in support of African Americans and integrated the U.S. Armed Forces with an executive order. This led many in the southern wing of the Democratic Party to stop supporting him and to form the National States' Rights Party. Democratic Congressman Strom Thurmond ran against Truman as a segregationist candidate in 1948. The famous photo showing Harry Truman holding up a newspaper that wrongfully reads, "Dewey defeats Truman," indicates how unlikely it was for him to be reelected in 1948. The Democratic vote was split three ways. The Roosevelt, pro-peace, and anti-racist Democrats voted for Henry Wallace. The segregationist Democrats voted for Thurmond. The only way Truman was able to defeat the Republicans was with his party's votes split three ways was due to the corruption of the urban political machines. In places like Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, and Chicago, votes for Henry Wallace were largely not counted. Many southern states simply did not allow Wallace's name on the ballot because he opposed segregation. Even amid all the heavy repression, the Communist Party was still able to pretty dramatically influence a national election in the United States by staffing and popularizing Henry Wallace's Progressive Party campaign. The Communist Party was able to hold one successful rally against the Korean War in New York City. Members assembled and unfurled anti-war banners before being attacked by the police. They then scrambled and reconvened at another rendezvous point and did the same thing until the police came again. They repeated this for the entire day, disrupting the streets of Manhattan and unfurling anti-war banners supporting the Korean people against U.S. imperialism. Novelist Howard Fast described how the Communist Party found other creative ways to get its message out in an atmosphere of almost universal censorship and government persecution. He wrote, "We wanted to do something for the people that were imprisoned, either because they wouldn't name names or because they were involved in communist leadership. I wrote an impassioned speech against the police state and against war, and then I recorded it in a friendly studio. We rented a room, Irv and I and Julie Turpin, in the old Astor Hotel on the 12th floor, if I remember correctly, with a loudspeaker and good amplification. We had a timer start the record, and we set up a mechanism, and we opened the window and set up a speaker on a chair facing the window toward Broadway. We closed the door behind us and broke the key in the lock. Then we went down the street and waited on the east side of Broadway. It was quite extraordinary. Everyone in the area heard a loud voice demanding an end to the drive toward war. The record was 18 minutes long, and the message finished and started over again, and finished and began to play a third time, almost finished from its third playing before they finally got into the room and stopped it. From this distance, it may seem like a childish caper. But remember that except for a handful of left-wing periodicals with a combination circulation of 200,000, the vast apparatus of media was closed to any of our ideas, closed to any and all arguments for peace. We felt it was not enough to face imprisonment, blacklisting, and slander. We had to be heard. Forging American Communism, The Life of William Z. Foster, quotes internal communications detected by the FBI, showing that Foster was not thrilled about endorsing Henry Wallace in 1948. Foster was recorded by the FBI telling his comrades, quote, "Before we were tagging along with the Democrats, now with Wallace. The Communist Party must not make the same mistake we made 20 years ago regarding the third party movement, or history will repeat itself and we will be no further ahead 20 years from now." Foster's 1949 book, The Twilight of World Capitalism, was dedicated to my great-grandson, Joseph Manley Colco, who will live in a communist United States of America. He wrote, "If I were starting my life all over again, I would take the same course as I have done. But naturally, I would try to bypass the many political mistakes that I have made. One thing I would do, despite the press of practical work, would be to better organize my time than I have to enable me to indulge more into the reading of science and history that I love so much. This is one thing that the youth in the labor and communist movement should do resolutely and strive to accomplish, to combine the theoretical with the practical." He also wrote, "We communists revere our country. We are ardent patriots, but we are not nationalists. We defend the people's interests, but we do not try to shove the official American capitalist interests ahead of the expense of other people's. For this is the road to war and to general ruin." In the book, Foster felt a need as an Irish American to strongly condemn the Vatican for its collaboration with fascism during the Second World War and the anti-communist hysteria in the post-war years. The text also highlights how the Communist Party sought to build an anti-monopoly coalition of different forces from all across society who would oppose the drive toward war and fascism. During these years, the FBI was making deep inroads into the Communist Party and its leadership. Morris Childs, who had been out of a job at the Daily Worker in 1947 for being a perceived ally of Earl Browder and quit the party in anger, became an FBI informant. Morris became very ill with a serious heart condition, and his brother Jack Childs was approached by the FBI about becoming an informant. Starting in 1952, the FBI paid for Morris Childs' medical bills at the Mayo Clinic in Chicago and began working with other informants to get him back into the party. Nelson Peary, an African-American communist organizer in Cleveland, described how the FBI approached him, setting up a situation in which they hoped he would be willing to cooperate with them. "I started handing out leaflets. Those who took them seemed shocked and angered to see that a real live communist would come to their shopping district and boldly pass out a leaflet. The backward glares as they hurried away were warning enough to get ready. A few moments later, 3 young toughs, perhaps in their late 20s, approached me. 'What you handing out?' one of them said to me. 'You can't pass out those. Give me those goddamn leaflets.' I got a right to pass them out. If you don't like it, too bad." The crowd had grown from 7 into a mob. They were cursing and shouting, urging one another to start a fight. Break it up, stand back, FBI, break it up." 2 men holding their gold badges and guns up in front of them parted the crowd. "What the hell are you doing, Peary? Trying to start a riot?" Walking between them to the waiting car, I didn't answer. As we pulled away from the mob, one of the agents turned to me. "My name is Fred Anderson. I just got transferred from the Chattanooga office. You're damned lucky we came by here." "Well, I never thought I'd be glad to see the FBI before. Thanks." Something didn't jive. These guys just happened to come along, and now they were talking to me like I was their long-lost buddy. "I'd ask you a question. Why are you wasting your life? These people you're associated with, they aren't serious." "I'm serious, and I think I'd be wasting my life if I went along with all this. You've got to admit things are getting better. I have a feeling they are going to get a lot better. You can contribute to that." Suddenly, it was clear. The whole thing had been a setup. They set up a situation where I would be dependent on them, willing to listen to them, maybe become a cog in their network inside the party. I think I am contributing to it. Look, I really thank you, gentlemen, for what you've done. I don't want to appear ungrateful, but I don't want to talk to you about the party. "Okay, it's your life. When you find out we're telling you the truth, come talk to us. No one will ever know." They pulled over to 9th and Euclid. I thanked them as politely as I could, and I got out of the car. The Rosenbergs were executed that night, despite worldwide protests. Starting around 1952, the FBI switched its tactics to disrupting the party from within, rather than trying to crush it with prosecutions. In order to more or less destroy the party, the FBI seized on the issue of race. The Communist Party's national office announced an internal campaign against white chauvinism. The FBI arranged for a large number of members to be expelled for alleged racism. Nelson Peary explains this sinister tactic. The strongest rampart of the party was its historic work with and for the African American liberation movement. The FBI understood this was also their least defensible point. It was a point of penetration into the party, and some of the most destructive work was done through black informers. Accusing a white comrade of chauvinism or getting some black informer to do so was akin to a political lynching. For honest party members, the struggle against white chauvinism became a lose-lose situation. American novelist Howard Fast described the atmosphere in the party that was created by the FBI. I have written a piece about a meeting I had written a piece about a meeting that I had addressed in Boston. I described a mixed group of boys and girls, white and Negro. The piece was for the Daily Worker newspaper. I was brought up on charges of white chauvinism. Why? Any reference to Negro boys or girls was considered chauvinist. Bullshit, I told them, that it was absolute bullshit and that it made no sense. I protested that they were kidding. In retrospect, I asked myself, why didn't I say, expel me, to hell with it? But retrospect has no validity. No, damn it, let them be as loony as they wish to be. They were not going to expel me, so I agreed that I would work on this problem and see the error of my ways. Peary described how the FBI informants and the Communist Party's leadership often moved in to squash local organizers who seemed to be making a difference. He described how in 1953, the Communist Party formed the National Negro Labor Council and organized a boycott of Sears Roebuck because it refused to hire black employees. There were more than 3,000 people in front of the Sears building already. The cops stood in squads, fondling their clubs, occasionally sliding a gloved hand out to touch the butt of a pistol. Peary describes how in response to the success of the Communist Party's leadership, they demanded they withdraw from the National Negro Labor Council. I just received a special delivery letter from New York. There has been a Central Committee decision that the party is to quit the Labor Council. It sounds like the government has already gotten what it was after. Now, in return, the party must withdraw from the National Negro Labor Council and liquidate party's work in the South and in Puerto Rico. The 1956 crisis and Foster's retirement. On the 20th of February, 1956, the Communist Party convened its 20th Party Congress, and the first Congress since the death of Stalin. Nikita Khrushchev, the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, convened a special session for party delegates only, with foreign guests and the press excluded. In the special session, Khrushchev gave a presentation called "On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences." The speech was then distributed to top party leaders in envelopes marked top secret and was hence known as the secret speech. Khrushchev said, After Stalin's death, the Central Committee of the party began to implement a policy of explaining concisely and consistently that it is impermissible and foreign to the spirit of Marxism-Leninism to elevate one person, to transform him into Superman, possessing supernatural characteristics akin to those of a god. Such a man supposedly knows everything, sees everything, thinks for everyone, and can do everything, and is infallible in his behavior. Such beliefs about a man, specifically about Stalin, were cultivated among us for many years. The objective of the present report is not a thorough evaluation of Stalin's life and activity. Concerning Stalin's merits, an entirely sufficient number of books and pamphlets and studies have already been written during his lifetime. The role of Stalin in the preparation and execution of the socialist revolution, in the Civil War, and the fight for the construction of socialism in our country is universally known. Everyone knows this well. At present, we are concerned with a question that has immense importance for our party now and the future: how the cult of the person of Stalin which has become a certain specific stage and source of a whole series of exceeding serious and grave perversions of party principle and party democracy and party legality. The speech proceeded from there to accuse Stalin of being the very tyrannical madman the mainstream capitalist press had always said that he was. Stalin, on the other hand, used extreme methods, mass repression at the time when revolution was already victorious. It is clear here that Stalin showed in wholesome series of cases intolerance, brutality, abuse of power. Instead of proving his political correctness and mobilizing the masses, he chose the path of repression and physical annihilation, not only of actual enemies, but against individuals who had not committed any crimes against the party and the Soviet government. Khrushchev went on to list a number of individuals who had been arrested and executed during the 1930s, saying that they had been innocent and simply persecuted to secure Stalin's grip on power. He concluded the speech by saying, "Comrades, in order to not repeat the errors of the past, the Central Committee has declared itself resolutely against the cult of the individual. We consider that Stalin was excessively extolled. However, the past Stalin doubtless performed great services to the party, to the working class, and the international workers' movement. We cannot say that these were deeds of a giddy despot. He considered that this should be done in the interest of the party, of the working masses, in the name of the defense of the revolution's gains. In this lies the whole tragedy, comrades. We must abolish the cult of the individual once and for all. We must draw the proper conclusion concerning both ideological and theoretical and practical work. It is necessary for this purpose. Comrades, the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union has manifested with a new strength the unshakable unity of our party and its cohesiveness as the Central Committee, its resolute will to accomplish the great task of building communism, and the fact that we present in all their ramifications the basic problems of overcoming the cult of the individual, which is alien to Marxism-Leninism, as well as the problems of liquidating its burdensome consequences, evidence of the great moral and strength of our party. Vince Copeland reflects that much of the speech's content was obviously false. Among other things, Khrushchev showed how when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, it was totally unprepared, how Stalin had bungled everything, showed how Stalin had chopped off all the generals, kept on emphasizing that Stalin was crazy, Stalin was mad, and so forth. He exaggerated, too. He said that Stalin was afraid, that he hid under the table, all these things. Well, Trotsky had said that Stalin could look danger straight in the eye. His problem was not personal cowardice. But the fact that Khrushchev attacked him on a personal level just showed Khrushchev was looking for more and more things to attack him with. It's also important, by the way, to remember that in this whole attack, Khrushchev never attacked Stalin for anything he did conciliating with the United States or with England. He attacked Stalin for the way he fought Hitler, knowing that Hitler was also the enemy of the United States. In other words, Khrushchev was aiming for a pact with the United States, and he was aiming to please U.S. imperialism. Dr. Grover Furr of Montclair State University published the book Khrushchev Lied in 2011, debunking the speech point by point, showing that Khrushchev's claims about persecuted individuals simply do not match Soviet official records. That were made available to academics after the fall of the USSR. By March of 1956, word had trickled into the international press and the U.S. communist movement that Soviet leadership now spoke negatively of Stalin. Copeland recalled the atmosphere in New York City. This all came out, and it came out with a terrible shock to the Communist Party, and a lot of criticisms of Stalin came out at that time, and there was nobody who could answer them. And that's the point. See, today it's easy when you're not confronted with all these things to say, oh, well, that was an exaggeration. But there was nobody that could answer anything they said about Stalin at the time. The text of Khrushchev's secret speech was first read at an internal meeting of the Communist Party's National Committee in late April of 1956 in New York City. Steve Nelson recounted the event in his autobiography, American Radical, which was included in the volume Communism in America, A History of Documents, edited by Albert Fried. Nelson recalled, the National Committee itself consisted of 65 people, but this meeting was a plenum, which meant many key people at the district level, trade union, and party organizers, for example, were invited. I was elected to chair the session and took my seat at a table facing 120 people, the collective backbone of the party. I'd never enjoyed chairing meetings. It meant keeping one eye on the clock and sometimes cutting people off when they were exceeding their allotted time. But it was especially uncomfortable in this session. Someone from the administrative committee that made arrangements for the meeting asked that we remove all notebooks and pencils and pens. There were to be no notes taken. The comrade who brought the speech rose and proceeded to read it in its entirety, which took an hour and a half. The words of the speech were like bullets, and each found its place in the heart of veteran communists. Tears streamed down the faces of men and women who had spent 40 or more years in the party, their whole adult lives in the movement. I looked on the faces of people who'd been beaten up or jailed with me and thought of the hundreds more that I'd encouraged to join the party. And my head was swimming. The most astounding thing was that some were so rigid that not even this shock would move them. William Z. Foster and others acknowledged that it was a terrible thing, but insisted that they were still on the right path and that the Soviet leaders could overcome this problem. A few defended Stalin, arguing that he should still be respected for his great accomplishments. The emotion produced by that shock seemed to harden the divisions that had been growing for some time within the national leadership of the party. The Communist Party began convening public meetings to more or less apologize for its defense of the Soviet Union. Vince Copeland explained, at the beginning of 1956, there were 17,000 members of the Communist Party. And the first sign that something was wrong was when they started to have these big open meetings, self-criticism meetings. I went to them. I was in New York at the time, and I went to all of them. And anyone could get up and say things and so forth and so on. And it was okay. It was democratic and everything, but they just didn't know what to say. You could see that the membership and the leaders were completely on the defensive. In March of 1956, the Daily Worker was honoring William Z. Foster's In March of 1956, the Daily Worker was honoring William Z. Foster's 75th birthday with a series of poems and tributes. A special issue of Political Affairs, the Communist Party's theoretical magazine, was dedicated to going over Foster's achievements in defeating Browderism, building the labor movement, and holding the party together. Shortly afterward, the Daily Worker began publishing letters criticizing Stalin and celebrating de-Stalinization in the Soviet Union, and in the process throwing jabs at Foster. Edward P. Johannesmeer, his book, Forging American Communism, quotes one such letter published saying, I wonder if some of the rather maudlin testaments to William Z. Foster on his recent birthday are really the most mature and effective way of acknowledging the respect due America's outstanding working class leader. Foster wrote articles echoing the rising criticism of Stalin, but internally he saw that something was rotten. At the same time, those relishing the new denunciations of Stalin seemed to consistently take aim at Foster as well. Things escalated on June 5th, 1956, when the New York Times published a leaked transcript of Khrushchev's secret speech. The Daily Worker published the speech shortly afterwards, but Howard Fast recalls how printing it was met with opposition. We printed the text of the secret speech in the Worker. We were the only communist newspaper in the world to do so, and we did it in the face of opposition from the Foster Group. They still had the Communist Party, or what was left of it, in thrall, and they did not go along with the paper. The talk of supposedly tyrannical and authoritarian Foster Group seems to fill the pages of memoirs by people who, like Howard Fast, turned against the Soviet Union in the coming months. The Communist Party published a document called Communists Take a New Look, written by Eugene Dennis in 1957. The Communist Party published a document called The Communists Take a New Look, written by Eugene Dennis announcing that at the upcoming convention in 1957, the party would discuss dissolving into a mass party of socialism and dropping Marxism-Leninism and all ties to the Soviet Union. John Gates, who controlled the Daily Worker, began publishing not only calls for the party to dissolve, but also U.S. propaganda about events in Hungary that contradicted the events on the ground as reported in Soviet media. Foster called out the barrage of anti-Soviet and anti-party statements being made, despite agreeing that some kind of assessment of the mistakes of the Stalin era was needed. He pointed out that many of the letters published in the Daily Worker and claims made at party meetings were, quote, flagrant misrepresentation of policies, open advocacy of a return to Browderism, sniping at the Soviet Union, and even proposals for liquidating the Communist Party. Joe Hanningsmeer quotes Foster saying, "This is not party democracy. This is political stupidity. It's high time our party take this situation in hand, and while welcoming constructive discussion and criticism, put a sharp stop to anti-party attacks going on in our press." Peggy Dennis, the spouse of Eugene Dennis, who eventually resigned from the Communist Party, published a memoir in 1977 in which she accused the party of concealing how much Foster was suppressed and how much he opposed the moves of the party in the final years of his life. She wrote, "From the beginning of the 1960s, the official party version of that 4-year period has been that there was a struggle between the Browder-like revisionism of John Gates, the editor of the Daily Worker, and a staunch, victorious defense of the party led by William Z. Foster. Documents of that time and the personal experience of thousands who went through the fight tell a different story. In reality, the period of 1956 to 1960 was a fight against both the revisionism of the Gates group and the sectarianism of the Foster group. The 1957 convention of the Communist Party had 3 factions contending for power. The Gates group wanted to dissolve the party and completely drop Marxism-Leninism. The centrist faction, led by Eugene Dennis and Gus Hall, wanted to maintain the party and ties to the Soviet Union, but embrace Khrushchev's secret speech and de-Stalinization. The Foster group defended Stalin and refused to accept the highly negative assessment of party work in the 1930s and 40s that was now being presented. A major issue of disagreement was the Black Belt thesis and the question of Black nationalism. Foster and his allies maintained that Black people constituted an oppressed nation. They advocated support for Black nationalism. The Gates and Dennis factions advocated more or less adopting the perspective of the recently emerging civil rights movement, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., viewing the struggle of Black people as simply a struggle for bourgeois democratic rights against discrimination and segregation. Nelson recalls how a number of the most prominent people of color resigned from the Communist Party at the convention and formed a new organization. The Provisional Organizing Committee to reconstitute a Marxist-Leninist Communist Party in the United States had been one of the major caucuses within the Communist Party at its 16th National Convention. At the convention, the party confirmed its turn to the right. The Provisional Organizing Committee declared its policy of disengagement as a body walked out. The POC was the most working class of any group and had some of the most developed and practical leaders of the movement. Harry Haywood, veteran African-American communist and leader of Negro Liberation, and Joe Doer, former military commander of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which fought in the Spanish Civil War, were elected co-chairs. Armando Roman, former chair of the Queens Communist Party Committee, was elected general secretary of the Provisional Organizing Committee. Armando, being the only remaining elected official, finally got up from his chair and walked up to the podium. Looking through his thick glasses, he said, "I don't see nothing here but, 2 racial slurs. Do you think we can build a communist party?" The room fell into shocked silence, and then suddenly applause and cheers broke that silence. Something wonderfully new was happening. White intellectuals who understood and were on our side had always led us, but they had walked out. I looked around the room. There were 3 or 4 white comrades. The rest were black and Puerto Rican workers. We knew we were the proletariat Marx had spoken of: longshoremen, bricklayers, carpenters, sailors, stock clerks, factory workers, and janitors. It was a moment of euphoria. We were the workers, and we were going to build the Communist Party. John Gates and his allies were pushed out of the Communist Party in 1958 when they continued to insist on publishing anti-Soviet articles in the Daily Worker. William Z. Foster was forced to retire and given the title of Chairman Emeritus, and many of his closest allies resigned to join the Provisional Organizing Committee and other anti-revisionist groups that refused to accept de-Stalinization. Much of the party's self-criticism during the 1956 to 1958 period involved claiming that decisions Foster had made while running the party had weakened it or prevented it from growing. The irony of these statements is that after Foster's retirement into the role of Chairman Emeritus, the party never regained anything near the amount of influence, membership, and effectiveness it had had when Foster had led it. There was a brief upsurge in Communist Party membership during the early 1970s when Angela Davis was rising in prominence among Black Americans, and many 1960s radicals were looking to join a more ideological organization, but it was short-lived. The Communist Party's membership has never exceeded more than a few thousand since the 1957 convention, though the organization holds on to a number of high-value real estate properties and a decent stock portfolio. In 1959, Chairman Emeritus William Z. Foster sent a 5,000-word letter to the leader of the Communist Party of China, Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong replied with a letter honoring Foster as a glorious leader and fighter for America's working class. The New York Times published the letter and Mao's reply, and the Communist Party's leadership was furious that Foster had written to Mao without getting permission. They reluctantly published it in Political Affairs in order to avoid embarrassment after it had already appeared in the New York Times. The letter more or less consisted of Foster defending the Communist Party's achievements under his leadership against the wave of self-criticism his organization was engaged in, tarnishing its own history in the name of de-Stalinization. The letter was also a subtle gesture of sympathy for Beijing, as the Sino-Soviet split was brewing, and Mao Zedong was soon to declare Khrushchev a revisionist, and that the secret speech was a fraud. Foster ended the letter with a postscript referencing his deteriorating health. I am sorry I cannot sign my name since my right arm is still paralyzed. Foster moved to the Soviet Union to receive medical care, though it took a legal battle for his passport to be issued. Foster was still under indictment by the Department of Justice under the Smith Act, but had never been tried due to his health and his old age. Finally, in 1959, the court relented and lifted the indictment so Foster could spend his final months in the Soviet Union. The government had previously declared Foster to be ineligible to receive Social Security on the grounds that his work for the Communist Party constituted acting as a foreign agent. The Social Security Administration attempted to force him to pay back thousands of dollars in benefits, but this was ultimately defeated in court. Eugene Dennis and former steelworker organizer Gus Hall became the primary leaders of the party after the 1957 convention. Eugene Dennis had a heart attack and died in 1961, and for the remainder of the Cold War and until his death in 2000, Gus Hall functioned as the main leader and public spokesperson of the Communist Party. A physically large man of Finnish heritage, born in Minnesota, who had lived most of his life in Ohio, Hall was identified with Foster and his tradition of labor militancy. Gus Hall had served a longer prison sentence than other leaders convicted in 1948 because he had tried to flee and was extradited from Mexico. Hall became a kind of sainted figure among those who had spent their youth or early adulthood in the party. He provided a kind of nostalgia. Though Hall had been a centrist and not sided with Foster in the fights surrounding the 1957 convention, to those who had lived through the Great Depression, he was a reminder of the good old days, when the party had been huge and was building the CIO in alliance with Roosevelt. Hall used working class as an adjective, a habit he had picked up from Foster, saying, "That's a real working class attitude," or "That's a working class way of doing things." He entertained audiences and guests at house parties with stories of strong-armed tactics on the picket line. All of this was reminiscent of the speaking style and rhetorical approach cultivated by Foster's crew of labor organizers, going back to the Syndicalist League of North America, right up to the triumph over Earl Browder. FBI informant Morris Childs became a member of the National Committee and spent the following decades smuggling money into the United States from the Soviet Union and overseeing a whole network of informants who more or less controlled the organization and prevented it from really growing. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his work by Ronald Reagan. Khrushchev visited Foster in the hospital in March of 1960 for his 80th birthday. Foster shocked the Soviet head of state and his team by giving a speech from his hospital bed honoring Mao Zedong and the Chinese Revolution, more or less taking a swing at Khrushchev for having cut ties with China. Foster died a few months later on September 1st, 1960. His memorial was held in Carnegie Hall in Manhattan, attended by roughly 1,000 people, among them trade unionists, personal friends, Communist Party members, and others he had worked with and touched throughout his life. The American Nazi Party stood outside with 2 members in full uniform, holding signs that said, "We hate Reds," and "One less red rat." That's the end. And that is my book, William Z. Foster and the Communist Party.
Wall Street, with its fascist-like Taft-Hartley bill, also wants to kill the Communist Party. But they will fail in this as in their other anti-labor objectives. The workers, the American people, need a strong Communist Party, and it will be built despite Wall Street profiteers and exploiters.
You have heard William Z. Foster, chairman of the Communist Party, which purchased the foregoing 15 minutes.